I never thought I'd see the day I'd call a tow truck on a neighbor, let alone do it twice. But when a person's had enough, they've simply had enough. It wasn't that I carried a chip on my shoulder or that I hated the woman who lived across the street. Truth be told, Karen wasn't always unbearable. She used to wave politely when I watered the azaleas in the morning or when I dragged my trash bin to the curb. But something changed after she came back from an extended trip, and that's when things took a dramatic, head-scratching turn. It all started, as many neighborly disputes do, with my driveway. My property sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, lined with old oak trees whose branches arch over the street in a picturesque way that real estate agents love to showcase. I've lived here for 12 years, inheriting the house from my parents who built it in the 1970s. They poured everything into this place, from the carefully laid brick walkway to the modest but well-maintained front yard. So I can't help feeling a certain protectiveness about what happens on the property, especially the driveway. The day Karen parked in my driveway for the first time, I was stunned. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I just returned from the grocery store. I saw her taupe sedan, angled almost diagonally, hogging the space as if she owned it. One tire even sat on the grass, messing up the edge of my carefully trimmed lawn. I was baffled. Why on earth would she need to do that when her own driveway was only a few yards away? My first reaction was to check if maybe she had some emergency. That seemed plausible, given the haphazard way she'd left her vehicle. But as I peered through the window, I saw no activity coming from her side of the street. No frantic rushing, no ambulance, nothing at all. I took a deep breath, walked over, and politely knocked on her door. After a solid minute, she answered, a magazine rolled up under her arm, looking at me with an expression torn between boredom and mild annoyance. "Karen," I said, forcing a neighborly smile, "is there something wrong with your driveway? I noticed your car is parked in mine." She shifted her weight and crossed her arms. "Oh, that," she said dismissively. "I was running errands and didn't feel like backing out onto the street. You're on a cul-de-sac, so it's easier to maneuver here." Well, that explained the diagonal parking job, but not her blasé attitude. I tried to remain calm. "Okay, I get that it might be easier, but this is my driveway, and I need to come and go too." She shrugged, told me she'd move it sometime tonight, and closed the door. No apology, no acknowledgement. I stood there, my groceries in the car, still needing to be unloaded, feeling my blood pressure spike. It was such a small inconvenience in the grand scheme of things, but it rankled me. The nerve. That night, Karen did move her car at 10 p.m. I only knew because the headlights flashed across my living room window. I decided not to make a big deal about it. Maybe it was a one-off. Perhaps she genuinely thought it was no trouble. I reminded myself that some people are just oblivious rather than malicious, and I let it go. But then it happened again the next day. This time, I nearly hit her car while pulling in because she parked even further onto my lawn. Seeing the deep ruts her wheels carved in my grass made me see red. I marched to her house, knocked harder than I intended, and tried to keep my voice controlled when she answered. "Karen, I'm sorry, but you can't keep using my driveway as an overflow lot," I said, a bit of frustration creeping into my tone. "I thought you wouldn't mind." She responded breezily, like she was asking to borrow sugar. "Your driveway is practically empty during the day." I couldn't believe she'd said that. Technically, yes, I live alone, so I don't fill my driveway with cars. But that doesn't give the entire neighborhood open season on my property. "I do mind," I said firmly, "and I'd appreciate it if you respect my property." She mumbled something about how people could be so territorial and slammed the door in my face. At that moment, I realized I was dealing with a different version of Karen than the polite neighbor who once complimented my flower beds. This new Karen seemed convinced that my driveway was hers for the taking. Over the next few days, her parking escalated from an occasional annoyance to a near-daily intrusion. She'd wedge her sedan at odd angles, blocking me from leaving. One morning, I nearly missed a doctor's appointment because I had to knock several times before she came to move her car. By then, I'd started taking pictures, documenting everything, just in case. Talking to her wasn't working, that much was clear. So I decided to take the matter to the Homeowners Association, HOA. I've never been the kind of person who hides behind bureaucracy, But the HOA existed for situations just like this, didn't it? A quick call to one of the board members assured me they'd look into it. I thought, great, I'll get some official support and we can move on. Little did I know, that was only the beginning. I had no clue how unhelpful the HOA would turn out to be, nor how stubborn Karen could become. And I definitely never envisioned I would summon not one, but two tow trucks to my sleepy little cul-de-sac. HOA meetings in our neighborhood typically revolve around minor landscaping issues or whether someone's fence is 6 inches too tall. But I pinned my hopes on them when I reported Karen's driveway invasions. After all, it was clearly a violation. Her car was on my private property, tearing up the lawn. I wasn't asking for anything extreme, just that they sent her a warning letter or some official communication that said, you can't park in other people's driveways. I filed my complaint on a Monday morning, attaching a few photographs as evidence, and waited for a response. The following Saturday, I attended the monthly HOA meeting in the community center's multipurpose room, complete with its dreadful fluorescent lighting and gray folding chairs. I recognized most of the faces from block parties or yard sales. Eventually, the board chair, a slightly disheveled retiree named Mr. Higgins, got around to reading my complaint. His eyebrows shot up when he flipped through the photos. This is unusual. We typically see complaints about street parking, he said, glancing at me over his bifocals. But not someone parking right in your driveway. Several neighbors murmured in surprise. Others shot me sympathetic looks. Then came the official line. We'll send Karen a formal letter requesting that she stop immediately or face potential fines. I breathed a small sigh of relief. At least the HOA was on my side, so it seemed. But the letter came and went, and Karen continued to park exactly where she pleased. If anything, she doubled down after the notice, as though she considered a challenge. I look out my kitchen window and see her sedan once again angled over my lawn. She didn't respond to knocks or doorbells. Sometimes she'd pretend not to be home, even though I'd see her curtains twitch. I complained a second time. The HOA threatened fines, but those would take months to go into effect, pending more documentation and proof. It was becoming clear that the wheels of bureaucracy turned too slowly for my liking. I needed a more direct approach. That direct approach came one rainy afternoon. I'd been out shopping for a new wheelbarrow because my old one had rusted through. When I got home, I found Karen's car planted smack dab in the middle of my driveway, puddles forming around its tires. Thunder rumbled overhead, and fat raindrops pelted my windshield as I pulled up behind her. I honked, hoping she'd come out, but there was no sign of movement. After a tense 5 minutes, I ran through the downpour to her door, banging until my knuckles ached. She never answered. Maybe she was inside with headphones on, or maybe she was ignoring me again. That was my tipping point. I decided to call a towing company. The rain was intense, and I stood huddled under the small awning of my front porch, phone pressed to my ear, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. The man on the line just said, if it's private property and you can prove you're the owner, we can tow. So that's what happened. Seeing that truck's flashing lights was a bizarre mix of relief and apprehension. The driver expertly hitched Karen's sedan, and I felt this enormous wave of guilt as I watched it pulled away into the storm. But I also felt vindicated. She'd left me no choice. Then, halfway through drying myself off, a strange thought struck me. What if Karen thinks it's stolen? Or worse, what if she tries something in retaliation? The uneasy feeling lingered, but I reminded myself that I'd followed the rules. She was on my property, refusing to move. Case closed, right? Karen returned later that evening and pounded on my front door with enough force to rattle the whole frame. She demanded to know where her car was, calling me names I'd never repeat in polite company. I told her I'd had it towed. Her face twisted with anger, and for a fleeting moment, I worried she might take a swing at me. Instead, she lunged forward, jabbed a finger in my direction, and hissed, "You'll regret this," before stomping back into her house. I wish I could say that was the end, but that was just towing number one. It's funny how a moment like that can feel so monumental, like everything is about to shift. Karen's threat lingered in the air, and I wondered if I had crossed a line. But I quickly decided I'd done what anyone else would do in my position. You can't let people walk all over you forever. A day passed. Then two. I began to relax, thinking maybe that confrontation made it clear I wasn't a pushover. Maybe now she'd back off. By the third day, my driveway was blissfully empty. No new tire tracks, no blocked exit when I needed to leave for my volunteer shift at the local library. I even caught a glimpse of Karen's blinds snapping shut when I left the house, like she was watching me, yet keeping her distance. Right at that moment, as I hopped into my car for my volunteer shift, I remember thinking, finally, it's over. I had no idea what would happen next, but sometimes the smallest choices can completely reshape your fate. Karen's anger and my decision to stand up for myself had led me here. Sometimes, timing changes everything. Just like subscribing to this channel seems to bring a dash of unexpected good fortune. But back to the story. I was about to taste that unexpected good fortune for precisely 2 days. Because on the third day, Karen upped the ante. I came home from my volunteer shift and discovered she'd parked in my driveway again. Only this time, her car was reversed right up to my garage door, leaving me no space at all. It almost looked intentional, as though she'd measured the distance to maximize inconvenience. What in the world? I muttered under my breath, astonished. Hadn't one towing experience taught her anything? I marched straight to her house. The overhead sun beat down on me, sweat pricking the back of my neck. I half expected her not to answer. Instead, she flung the door open so violently, I worried it might come off its hinges. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she wore a tense, furious expression. She cut me off before I could even speak. "You have some nerve," she snarled, stepping out onto her porch, crossing her arms in defiance. My mouth fell open. I had some nerve? Karen, you're on my property again. You must realize towing is going to happen if you keep doing this, I said, struggling to remain calm. She let out a bitter laugh. And how much do you think that costs? You think I care? She sneered, crossing her arms tighter, as though using them to hold in her fury. How about this? Maybe I'll tow your car next, just for fun. I felt my face go hot. I had half a mind to argue, but what good would it do? She was obviously beyond reason. It struck me then that this wasn't about convenience for her. It was about revenge, pride, or maybe a twisted game of one-upmanship that I hadn't realized we were playing. I whirled around, pulled out my phone, and dialed the towing company for a second time. They said they'd be there within an hour. Karen stood on her porch, glaring at me, daring me to follow through. Fine, she barked. Go ahead, tow it again. I did. The driver arrived, turning heads all along the street with the roar of his diesel engine. He greeted me politely, quickly assessed the situation, and attached Karen's car to the tow truck. Karen stared from her porch, arms still folded, lips pressed thin. She offered no protest this time, only a scowl. As the truck rumbled away, a couple of neighbors, who must have heard the commotion, shuffled out of their homes, curious about what was happening. I noticed Mr. Higgins from the HOA peering through his window. The hush that settled felt more awkward than triumphant. Sure, I protected my property rights, but I felt none of the relief I'd experienced the first time. Instead, a pit of anxiety churned in my stomach, because I knew, deep down, this wouldn't end here. I was right. Later that evening, I found a note tucked under my doormat. It said, in a messy scrawl, "You're playing a dangerous game, friend. Better watch that driveway." No signature, but I didn't need one to guess. Karen must have realized anger alone wasn't enough. She was trying intimidation now. Fighting a lump in my throat, I called my brother, who lived a couple of towns over, to vent. He's always been the level-headed one, offering practical advice whenever my temper flared. I recounted the entire saga, from the first incident to the threats and the second towing. After a thoughtful pause, he said, "Sam, it's your home. You did everything right. If she keeps it up, you might want to think about a restraining order or at least document everything." I already had plenty of documentation, photos, timestamps, copies of the HOA letters. The idea of a restraining order seemed extreme, but the note under my doormat sent a chill through me. It wasn't that I believed Karen was truly dangerous, but the stress was eating at me. I was constantly on edge, peeking outside to see if her car had reappeared or if she'd be waiting with some new stunt. The next morning, I found that she'd dumped a pile of grass clippings along the edge of my driveway, presumably to annoy me. I took a rake and cleared them, telling myself to stay calm. A few hours later, I heard a loud, scraping noise outside. When I looked, I saw her deliberately backing out of her own driveway and spinning her wheels on the curb so that gravel sprayed across my yard. She locked eyes with me, then revved her engine and sped away. By that point, neighbors began taking sides, or at least gossiping about whose side to take. Some quietly sympathized with me, believing Karen was out of line. Others found the whole thing ridiculous. "You live on a cul-de-sac, Sam. Can't you just ignore her?" They had no idea how impossible that was. For me, it wasn't about the inconvenience anymore. It was about respect. I was a homeowner, paying my mortgage, keeping my property in good shape, and abiding by the neighborhood rules. I had no interest in petty feuds or outrageous stunts. But Karen kept pushing, and the more she pushed, the more determined I felt not to bow to her behavior. Little did I know, there was more to Karen's story than met the eye. But I wouldn't discover that until much later, in a twist that made me question everything I thought I knew about her. The third morning after the second towing, I happened to see a van pull into Karen's driveway. On its side was a logo for a local caregiver's agency. A middle-aged woman stepped out, pulled out a clipboard, and headed for Karen's door. My curiosity piqued. Was Karen ill? Did she need some sort of assistance? It seemed out of character for her to have a visiting nurse or aide, but I found myself watching from my window, wondering what was going on. The woman stayed for nearly 2 hours. Around noon, she emerged, made a phone call, then left. For the next several days, the same van would show up at Karen's place. Once I caught sight of the caregiver helping Karen into a wheelchair ramp that I'd never noticed before. This left me torn between confusion and guilt. Despite our feud, I couldn't help feeling a pang of sympathy. Maybe she was dealing with health problems. But that didn't explain her antagonistic behavior toward me. If anything, you'd think ill health would make a person more appreciative of neighborly kindness, not less. Then one afternoon, I saw the caregiver leaving and decided to approach her. It was a bit nosy, I admit, but I felt compelled to figure out if there was some deeper reason behind Karen's hostility. The caregiver was initially hesitant to speak with me, citing privacy rules. But I guess she sensed my genuine concern, and she relented, only enough to say, "Karen's going through a hard time. It's best if she stays calm. Stress isn't good for her." Without divulging details, she implied Karen had some significant medical challenges, possibly involving her mental well-being as well. I stood there processing that new information, uncertain what to do with it. I still had 2 towing incidents under my belt, not to mention the intimidation note. If she was truly unwell, did that excuse her behavior? Or was I now supposed to just let her car sit on my property because she might be sick? The questions swirled in my head without easy answers. A week passed quietly. No parking incidents, no new notes. Then one morning, I found Karen herself, looking visibly more frail, standing at the edge of my driveway, staring at me as I watered my front garden. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "So, you really won't budge on this whole parking thing, will you?" I turned off the hose. "Karen, this has never been about budging. I just want you to respect my driveway. I'm sorry about towing your car, but I felt like I had no choice." She shook her head slowly, as if baffled by my refusal to roll over. "If you ever had to take care of someone, you'd understand," she muttered. "What do you mean?" I asked, wiping water from my hands. She hesitated, glancing back at her house. For the first time in ages, she actually looked vulnerable, not just angry. "I used to take care of my mother," she finally said, her voice wavering. She had a degenerative illness, and it was horrible watching her slip away. I was out of town trying to sort out her estate, and when I came back, I guess she didn't finish. I felt a knot form in my gut. Perhaps she'd poured all her energy into caregiving, lost her mother, then returned home to find life moving on as if nothing had happened. Her sense of loss could have turned into anger at the slightest inconvenience. But still, was that an excuse to park in my driveway and make my life miserable? There was a long silence before she spoke again. I know it doesn't justify anything. I'm just not myself right now. We stood there, the tension between us as thick as the midday heat. I wanted to say something comforting, but couldn't find the words. Instead, I managed, if you need help, or if you just need someone to listen, I can try. But you can't keep parking here and blocking me in. She clenched her jaw, nodded stiffly, then shuffled back into her house without another word. After that conversation, the dynamic changed. Karen didn't suddenly become my best friend, but she stopped parking in my driveway. She still lobbed a glare in my direction whenever we happened to cross paths. Yet, I noticed her backing out of her own driveway more carefully, no longer spraying gravel or squealing her tires. The HOA eventually closed the complaint. They fined her a small amount, which I think she paid begrudgingly. Life in the cul-de-sac settled into a new normal, tense but tolerable. I'd see the caregiver's van a few times a week, and every so often, a visiting nurse. I never pried, but I remained alert, half expecting another meltdown. Months went by without incident. Then one morning, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn. Within a few weeks, she moved out. I didn't get a farewell, nor did I expect one. I watched her leave with mixed emotions, relief, sadness, and a small measure of pity for whatever battles she'd fought behind closed doors. Looking back, the strangest part of all this wasn't towing her car twice. That's just a matter of property rights, as unpleasant as it was. The strangest part was discovering how thin the line can be between civility and chaos. A neighbor you've known for years can, under the right strain, become almost a stranger. And sometimes, if you both dig in your heels, you forget what you were fighting about in the first place. In the end, I believe I did the only thing I could do. I protected my property and my sanity, and I tried to extend an olive branch where possible. Karen might never see it that way, but that's all right. People carry burdens that we can't fully grasp, and sometimes those burdens spill over in ugly ways. To this day, I'm watchful whenever someone parks even close to my driveway. The memory of Karen's taupe sedan parked at a diagonal, and the tensions that followed, remains a reminder of how quickly neighborly lines can blur. And I can't help but think, whenever I see a tow truck rumble by, about those 2 times I had to pick up the phone and say, "Yes, come get it." It's not a memory I relish, but it's part of my story, one that, for better or worse, taught me about boundaries and empathy in ways I never anticipated. And so ends the saga of Karen and my driveway, an odd chapter in the life of our quiet cul-de-sac, one I never asked for, but will probably never forget.